Good afternoon. I'm Helen Folks, and I would like to welcome you to the Louisiana Department of Education's Nutrition Support Training on Hurricane Preparedness. As we've experienced with the COVID-19 pandemic, many unforeseen situations occur in a school food service operation that may compromise food safety and the ability of a school food service operation to provide safe meals. Child nutrition programs have been called to serve emergency meals to families over the past 2 years. Documenting procedures based on current emergency pandemic procedures in place has been a critical first step in developing a hurricane preparedness plan. The pandemic introduced unique challenges, while emergency planning for hurricanes provides its own set of disruptions and service threats that may compromise food safety, require advanced planning, training, and management. Hurricane planning for school year 22-23 will mean preparing a hurricane plan while working to recover regular C&P operations after the pandemic. It's no question Louisiana is one of the most vulnerable in the country when it comes to hurricanes. Hurricane Preparedness Week is May 1st through 7th, 2022, and the official start of hurricane season is June 1st. As stakeholders in supporting community nutrition outreach, the time is upon us to prepare for a hurricane before a weather event strikes. The Atlantic hurricane season is the period in a year from June through November when hurricanes usually form in the Atlantic Ocean. On a worldwide scale, May is the least active month, while late August through September are the most active. Arm yourself with knowledge of hurricane status definitions and a weather radio to stay alert during hurricane season. A weather radio is a specialized radio receiver that is designed to receive a public broadcast service, typically from government-owned radio stations like NOAA, which is pictured on this slide, and is dedicated to airing weather reports on a continual basis, with routine weather reports interrupted by emergency weather reports whenever needed. Weather radios are typically equipped with a standby alerting function. If the radio is muted or tuned to another band and a severe weather bulletin is transmitted, it can automatically sound an alarm and switch to a pre-tuned weather channel for emergency weather information. To listen to weather radio alerts online, go to www.weatherusa.net/radio. It's /radio. Often online services are disrupted early in a hurricane threat. Therefore, plan to use a battery-powered weather radio during the emergency and use the online resources in advance of a hurricane to familiarize yourself during the planning stages. The effects on food service operations and how to prepare for providing emergency meal services during those threats will be the focus as we work through this presentation. Major threats are typically flooding and wind damage. Making advanced preparations is recommended as crucial supplies can be scarce during a severe weather event. It is essential to train staff annually for power outages, water outages, or boil notices, floodwaters, and food safety or HACCP plans specific to a hurricane disaster. Remember when making plans for a hurricane that the category of the hurricane will make a difference in the duration of the hurricane or emergency situation you may be faced with. Hurricanes are categorized by the National Weather Service based on their intensity by using a scale of 1 to 5. The scale, which is outlined below, categorizes storms according to their sustained winds, the storm surges produced, and the damage expected as a result. LEAs often develop hurricane preparedness plans with a tiered response based on the hurricane scale. This is helpful when training staff on their role during a hurricane and what policies and procedures should be followed based on the scale of the emergency. Natural disasters can occur that affect operations for an hour, such as a temporary electrical outage, or for months. In light of the varying degrees a hurricane may affect your C&P operations, it is essential in tailoring hurricane plans specific to your LEA and each facility or school site in terms of providing meals during an emergency. For the purposes of this training, we will focus primarily on presidentially declared disasters. When the state of Louisiana determines a need for federal disaster assistance, the governor requests assistance from the president. Based on FEMA's evaluation and recommendation, a formal presidential major disaster or emergency declaration is then made. This is when waivers may be requested by the state agency. As an SFA, plan to contact the state agency to request assistance with planning for disaster meal services as soon as a serious hurricane threat to your parish or district approaches in order to receive guidance. Note that procedures begin when a situation of distress is determined by public officials. An emergency declaration addresses impending emergencies or disasters. It is issued when, in the determination of the president, federal assistance is needed to supplement state and local efforts and capabilities to save lives and to protect property and public health and safety, or to lessen or avert the threat of a catastrophe. A major disaster declaration is declared by the president when a major disaster has been assessed that overwhelms the combined capabilities of state and local government resources. Declaration of a major disaster then frees the financial, legal, and other resources USDA requires to grant waivers. Note that the process involved in a presidential declaration of a disaster requires time and multiple stages of assessment. Only after a major disaster declaration is declared by the president will USDA be able to consider waivers for approval for the child nutrition programs. This is why waivers are often published well after a hurricane devastates an area, and also is why communicating emergency situations with the state agency is necessary to receive programmatic guidance in the early stages when disaster strikes. With the understanding that inventory and food loss is a serious threat as a result of a hurricane, USDA may be able to provide tiered assistance for providing USDA foods through the state distributing agency, starting with a situation of distress. However, this depends on the resources available at the time of the event. In the aftermath of a disaster, school districts can provide critical nutrition support to students through the school, summer, and after-school nutrition programs. After a major disaster declaration is issued by FEMA, USDA has the authority to waive certain program requirements that limit access to meals in situations resulting from damage or disruptions due to natural or man-made disasters. School districts can work with their state child nutrition agency and USDA to apply for waivers from program requirements that would otherwise limit students' access to meals. For school year 21-22, a waiver covering COVID-19 pandemic meal services through SSO provided the option to SFAs to apply to provide free meals to students, which is a great advantage during hurricane season. However, please be aware that the SO option waiver and other COVID-19 waivers expire with the end of the current school year, and the availability of waivers will vary based on the extent of a hurricane disaster. For more information, see the USDA memo linked at the bottom of the slide regarding free meals eligibility and disaster benefits. Use the QR code on the screen by using your smartphone camera to look up the memo directly. Child nutrition program operators may assist families by encouraging the school community to pre-register annually for DSNAP before a disaster strikes. Disaster SNAP provides food assistance to eligible households who do not receive regular SNAP benefits and who need help buying groceries due to lost income or damages following a disaster. As a reminder to SFAs, DSNAP is coordinated by the Department of Children and Family Services. Disaster SNAP is similar to pandemic SNAP, but is provided in areas designated as part of a presidential disaster declaration. As a best practice, encourage parents to complete DSNAP pre-registration as part of school orientation, or include the link or QR code and instructions as part of the beginning of the school year packet, typically mailed to families. There are some reasons that families should pre-register, And they include that online pre-registration is simple and it can be done online through the CAPE customer portal. And pre-registration will speed up the application process that determines final eligibility after DSNAP is authorized. Remember that in the event of a hurricane or disaster, student families may not have the computer or Wi-Fi access required to begin pre-registration for DSNAP. For families that are pre-registered, a phone number is available for completing the final application step. DCFS will provide an electronic benefits card to eligible families, which allows them access to purchase much-needed foods during a disaster. Due to technology upgrades, DSNAP applications must be completed again this year and should be completed annually to ensure household information is up to date. As a child nutrition program operator, a particular benefit is that DSNAP goes toward the identified student percentage, or ISP, for calculating CEP eligibility. This may enhance CEP eligibility by site, system-wide, or may increase the level of free reimbursement for qualifying CEP sites in your SFA. In order to help minimize disruptions to families in the aftermath of a hurricane, CNP operators should provide information in the form of website links and printed information to families. Resources are listed on this page for families and also for program operators that require assistance during a disaster. The FNS Disaster Assistance link on this slide provides disaster resources for individuals, families, and for state and local operators. USDA Food and Nutrition Services also published the flyer linked on this slide titled Child Nutrition Programs During a Disaster. This guide provides information about how children may access healthy meals in the event of a disaster, discusses the type of meal sites that are available during emergencies, and provides information about shelters and offers safety tips. Next up for discussion is hurricane preparedness in light of COVID-19. And although there's a CDC report of a recent recovery from pandemic spikes, in order to keep up with the latest COVID-19 operational requirements and precautions, please use the links on this slide for the CDC's schools and child care programs COVID-19 information. Also, the LDH site on community and preventive health COVID-19 resources is available for your use. The CDC also has a site for tracking COVID-19 in your community or county with precautions to take based on current community levels. On April 19, 2022, the CDC announced the launch of the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics, which is called CFA. CFA seeks to enhance the nation's ability to use this analytical data to enable timely, effective decision-making in response to public health threats. Given what has occurred over the past 2 years, CNP operators may feel they are ready for any emergency given pandemic meal services. However, as we work toward recovery, keep in mind the unique threats a hurricane season may bring to your school system. Some examples include that hurricanes may bring disruptions in the form of electrical or gas outages, water outages or boil notices, wind and flood damage to buildings, food and supply loss, and added disruptions to deliveries or critical supplies, personal protective equipment, and food or beverage deliveries. Determining modes for communication, both internally and externally in the form of public outreach and notices, need to be developed and coordinated with risk and emergency management administrators within your district. Now is the time to develop a system for communications that is reliable and accessible both internally and throughout your school community. Training and outreach efforts to inform the public of how to access emergency information should start now. Ask yourself what communication systems will be in place when the electricity is down or when internet services are down or both. Commonly used apps for communications during an emergency may include Zello or FirstNet as smartphones app that are reliable for radio style communications when other cellular communications are down. Facebook Messenger, the Remind Me app, is a common education communication platform. Everbridge software is a platform for mass communications used in government, healthcare, and corporate arenas, which allows mass text email for employees with read-receive receipts. More than likely, one or more of these kinds of applications or software are already available for use in your district, either for staff, for emergency communications, or for school community-wide communications. Inquire about how and what communication platforms the CNP local program can participate in. Please add any other communication platforms used in your district to the chat box. And overall, please let us know how it's used. There are several different platforms out there, and there are advantages and disadvantages to pretty much any one, but these can be especially useful during a time of emergency or crisis. As a child nutrition program operator, developing a hurricane preparedness guide for child nutrition program managers and staff is essential. This guide should be provided in print for staff to take home and use during a hurricane threat or emergency. CNP operators should stay informed about district policies and stay involved as a member of risk management and emergency preparedness teams. This will ensure the needs of the food service operation are included in planning for safe shelter should a weather disaster arise unexpectedly. In order to ensure safe reentry after a hurricane event, and in order to provide ready access to information on resuming services after a hurricane, it's important that this communication maintain in place. USDA, in cooperative agreement with the Institute of Child Nutrition, developed the following manuals for hurricane preparedness and emergency readiness planning. This includes a guide for the school food service operation and a forms manual. It is important to print and develop this step-by-step plan and include this guide in district level planning for a seamless response to a hurricane or disaster. The manuals are linked on this slide and should be printed for developing a plan based on the unique needs of your district and CNP operations. Including LEA level risk management and emergency preparedness team plans and policies is essential for a unified response to meet the needs of the CNP operations during a hurricane or related disaster. For assistance in developing a hurricane plan and tailoring it for your district's child nutrition program, contact the Parish Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. Local contact numbers are included in the link on this slide. Also contact the state agency for any assistance with programmatic questions and procedures related to hurricane or disaster planning at childnutritionprograms@la.gov or by calling 225-342-9661. Contact information is linked on this slide for ease and access. In order to provide a visual, the links on the prior slide will bring you to the guide and forms for hurricane and other emergency readiness. These are the manuals you will need to complete, and there's a detailed process and also procedures required for a hurricane plan in the manual. When accessing the emergency plan guide, you will see that the top priority is developing a chain of command with specific duties outlined. Essential members of the response team included in the chain of command is also included in the forms guide. Identifying essential staff early is essential to the planning process. CNP operators have communicated that after identifying essential staff, that training and clear delegation of duties is of utmost importance in ensuring preparation and a coordinated response during and after a hurricane. It's also important to emphasize that during a hurricane, a command center or centralized location for communication and for workers to report for instructions is essential. Choose a location for a command center within your district that is outside of a flood zone or tends to be on higher ground. Ideally has generator backup available for electricity and has a sound structure. Electricity, computers, and regular telephone services will likely be unavailable throughout the district. Therefore, alternative methods of communication should be planned, including battery-powered two-way radios, pagers, and backup chargers available for cell phones. In terms of next steps for hurricane readiness and planning, step 2 is to identify disruptions that may challenge the ability of staff to provide meal services and the importance of determining safe alternatives. Step 3 is to develop a well-designed emergency readiness plan. Step 4 is to train child nutrition program staff on the hurricane readiness plan and procedures. Step 5 is to practice emergency readiness drills. And step 6 is to reassess the emergency plan and effectiveness and update or make changes where needed. Periodic reassessment and updates to emergency plans must be regularly scheduled in order to be effective. CNP operators who have successfully worked through devastating hurricanes have found that adapting to unexpected events and barriers is key to recovery and safe meal services. This requires cross-training staff for production and service duties, as well as clearly explaining expectations for flexibility in positions. Communicating the possibility that staff may have to report to alternative work sites should take place well in advance of a hurricane. An emergency plan is key to a coordinated response. In addition, identifying and establishing emergency resources and contacts is essential, taking place prior to a hurricane to ensure various threats and disruptions to services can be handled when they arise. The form section of the guide provided will assist you in developing a directory and guidebook for your CNP system. This slide shows the 10 steps to developing your guidebook. The Forms Guide provides these elements in a comprehensive manual for a one-stop resource to share with risk and emergency management teams, leadership, and essential staff. I will discuss the elements of the forms in the upcoming slides. To reduce possible confusion, identify the chain of command early in the development stage. Provide a copy of the chain of command to school administrators and school food service personnel. Identify the emergency response team coordinators or other school officials who will determine when to activate the plan. Include a calling system or phone tree to ensure a method for contacting everyone in the early stages of a hurricane threat. Also, post the chain of command in a common location at each food service operation so it is accessible to everyone. It will be critical to designate specific responsibilities for each of the emergency response team coordinators and ensure that the team is trained in those tasks assigned. The when, where, and how of emergency response is critical when training food service staff to respond to an emergency. It is also important to prepare staff for rotation of duties and to emphasize flexibility in assignments and the need to report to alternative work sites based on hurricane damage to buildings or for sites that are centralized for high volume services. Remember to verify and update the information in these forms prior to hurricane season and periodically thereafter. Also communicate with workers to ensure that you understand who may need to evacuate immediately upon hurricane threat due to family or other circumstances, and who will be more likely to be available to work when disaster strikes. Included in the form sections of the guide is a delegation of tasks list. This list outlines routine tasks and assignments in the food service operation. This list is useful during a time of food service disruption to allow reassignment of tasks to other trained individuals if usual staff is unavailable in the aftermath of a hurricane. After the task of developing the chain of command, emergency response team coordinators will need to be identified with contact information documented. If your food service operation does not have access to pagers and two-way radios, now is the time to organize assignment of district resources or purchase the necessary communication equipment. It is critical to identify the individuals who are responsible for and assigned pagers and radio communications, and to have the list posted in a common location. To ensure security and access during an emergency, identify the individuals who will have keys to the food service facilities. This list also must be readily accessible in print or posted in a common location. Identify school district contacts who will assist the food service operation in case of an emergency. Some examples may be principals, teachers, custodians, school nurses, PTO, and other community members. Next, you will identify local and state contacts, including local public health and state agency emergency contacts who will assist in the programmatic challenge that may arise, and to identify those who will assist in food service operations in an emergency. Some examples include public health officials, local sanitarians, Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness parish contacts, the Red Cross, FEMA, and the Division of Nutrition Support, state agency contacts. Online links to these agencies and public health officials are included on this slide. Utility companies and community relief organizations should be contacted during the planning stage to determine access to resources if essential food service operations are disrupted. A list of local companies or individuals that may be able to assist in transporting food and supplies for the food service operations or warehousing refrigerated or frozen foods should be listed with readily accessible contact information on hand. Discussing and arranging emergency operation for this type of assistance in advance is necessary to ensure that CDL licensed drivers are available to drive trucks and available workers are trained in transporting food safely when necessary. Message carriers may be required for timely communications for food service operations when computers, telephones, and other modes of communication are inoperable. Message carriers can deliver essential information to a command center or central location and assist with providing two-way radios or pagers to assigned individuals. As an addendum to the forms guide, identify local food sources that are available to replenish necessary foods in an emergency. It is important at this stage to identify your vendor's policies on deliveries prior to and during emergency situations, and to determine the actions staff will need to take to ensure emergency supplies and foods are accessible. A PAR level inventory should be developed based on hurricane menus planned with PPE needs for staff and the supplies that are necessary to provide meals that may be served by alternative methods. The next section of the forms manual is where standard operating procedures are documented as a plan for the safe provision of meal services when electricity, gas, or water service is disrupted. Safety guides addressing these outages will be provided later in this presentation. It is critical in the planning stage to develop a 3-day menu that meets component requirements and that includes shelf-stable items that may be served if the electricity is out or if a gas or water disruption allows for minimal cooking capabilities. Remember to include serving sizes based on the yield of those items to ensure meals are planned as reimbursable. While waivers may be in place for you to justify a missing component due to delivery issues or other disruptions, this type of waiver is only available on an as-needed basis, and missing a component should be avoided where possible. A checklist of emergency inventory is provided in the emergency guide. However, do not forget to include the recommendations of the CVC for required PPE, sanitation supplies, and equipment as part of a PAR level inventory for a 3 to 5 day emergency supply. The Community Relief Organization section provides an assessment tool for necessary relief that is needed when and provides for advanced planning and who to contact for various needs that may arise. As a note on community relief organizations, it is important to be knowledgeable about your district's plan for recovery after a hurricane. For example, will a contract agency be used for building repair, cleaning, and sanitation? Should a hurricane devastate your school buildings and kitchens? Or will the district plan to provide internal teams for recovery activities? For access to emergency equipment, supplies, and PPE, click the link located at the bottom of this slide for vendors providing emergency services and other items. Included in this list are trained service providers for recovery, emergency equipment like mobile refrigeration, freezers, rental trucks, and other emergency supply needs. CNP operators should contact key vendors in advance to determine how they may be able to respond with needed equipment, services, or items after a hurricane. In terms of menu planning, hurricane menu items should primarily be shelf-stable, including shelf-stable options for milk to meet Child Nutrition Program meal pattern requirements. Menus must include specific menu items and creditable portion sizes to show that reimbursable meal requirements will be met. These menu items may be used as part of an annual rotating menu to minimize warehousing and inventory burden. Emergency menus should be planned as part of operational costs to be expended on an annual basis. Keep in mind that these items may be utilized in times of other unexpected disasters like the winter storm that was experienced a year or two ago. In the instance that there are no unexpected interruptions to the planned menu, rotate emergency menu items into after-school programs to ensure shelf life, and FIFO. That's first in, first out. Disaster menu items may also be perceived by students as novel and desirable and may be used to boost participation during statewide testing. Certain emergency menu items that meet Smart Snack guidelines may be used as part of a la carte sales to boost income to the Child Nutrition Program account. Rotating use in this way will prevent spoilage and the burden of warehousing. Emergency foods not utilized during the school year may be used as part of the summer food service program. A best practice to attempt to salvage inventory under threat of a hurricane is to centralize storage of frozen and other foods in a location that is least likely to flood and is structurally sound. A location where generator backup is available for electrical outages is ideal, but that is largely dependent on the resources of your district. As you work through the completion of your hurricane emergency plan and forms, remember that periodic testing of emergency equipment, especially prior to hurricane season, is important. In the event of generator failure, or if no generator backup power is available, it's important to research possibilities for safe food storage. For example, you may identify a company that will serve as transport and for cold storage for foods, and keep a list of organizations like food banks that may be able to take food donations to avoid complete loss of inventory that would otherwise expire. Understand donation guidelines and regulations for both purchased and USDA foods prior to donating foods, and ensure that required documentation like inventory records are completed prior to donation. In preparation of a scenario where there is complete or partial loss of inventory, contact your business manager for information related to insurance coverage and the procedures and documentation required for filing a claim. In order to ensure that meals served during an emergency may be claimed for reimbursement, there are steps that should be followed. In certain instances, you may have to decide to serve a safe, nutritious meal that best meets component requirements, and then contact the state agency as soon as the immediacy of the emergency at hand is passed. The state agency works to accommodate these emergency situations, but cannot guarantee a decision on claiming those meals until the scenario is discussed with USDA. A to-do list for state agency approval includes keeping a list of state agency contacts and making initial contact with a state agency staff member as soon as a serious hurricane threat or event is identified, determining programs available for emergency meal services, determining waivers or flexibilities needed to provide the meal service type planned based on resources available, requesting waivers, flexibilities, or approval of a meal service plan based on the current assessment of the weather emergency, and being prepared to provide the state agency with a menu plan based on the meal type, with portion sizes included to illustrate how meal components will be met. Plan an accurate point of service and meal plan prepared based on the possibility of no electricity, access to computerized point of service systems, and/or delivery issues, which may be identified when contacting vendors. Ensure staff training is completed prior to initiating meal services, especially in terms of staff safety, food safety, sanitation, and accountability measures for documenting emergency meal service. Also clarify with the state agency staff what notes must be included in the CNP online application to ensure approval of the meal service by type and distribution method, and any waivers that must be submitted. During emergency situations, you may not have access to the online application, but you should plan to update online information as soon as services return. In order to create and communicate procedures for hurricanes, tailor a checklist like this one to your district for use by CNP managers during a hurricane threat. Managers at each site will be essential in executing the duties necessary to secure the plan you prepared for a hurricane. Explain where and when to report to work and if delays should be expected in serving students. Louisiana 511 is a valuable resource to provide to staff with continual updates about weather-related road conditions, road closures, and live video feeds from traffic cameras. Encourage staff to check on a safe route before leaving their homes. Request updated contact information or complete what is often called a calling tree to enhance notifications regarding a hurricane threat. Cell phone numbers, home numbers, and other means of contact should be obtained for all CNP staff. Managers should provide a good contact number for work-related questions. CNP directors and managers should provide contact information to principals. Distribute hard copies of essential phone numbers, menus, including the current month's menus, as well as emergency menus. Ensure each manager prints a current inventory list of food and supplies to take home and keep a second copy secured at the central office. Print student rosters and secure a copy in a high file drawer at the central office and at each school site. Establish contact with vendors regarding emergency supplies or foods needed for the emergency, and discuss emergency distribution plans. Place food, supply, and milk orders before leaving school. Milk orders should be placed as though no milk is on hand. For example, a 10-day supply of milk. Request vendor information about what the food and supply distribution plan is for weather emergencies, and request projected delivery plans. Ensure PPE and other supplies are ordered for delivery as though no items are on hand and to cover a period of time, for example, 10 days or more. The next part of the sample checklist is for CNP managers to do a facility review and to-do list. The facility portion includes securing all areas outside the building, inside, keeping items in inventory off the floor, and keeping all foods stored safely and appropriately. The last part of the checklist includes what must be done at each facility right before leaving for the day when a hurricane threat is imminent. For example, unplugging certain small wares and computers and storing them in a safe place will be important to ensuring working systems when returning to the building. Recording temperatures should occur regularly during the day and right before leaving to ensure that food recovery is handled in a safe way with time and temperature control in mind when returning to the building. In terms of delivery trucks, assigned drivers should fill up fuel tanks with gas before leaving for the day and report to the transportation department to ensure trucks are parked in a secure and safe location, with keys stored appropriately for access by the emergency response team. The Institute of Child Nutrition is providing a webinar tomorrow, Thursday, April 28th at 2:00 p.m. Central Time. Please register for this event at the registration link on this slide or by going to the Institute of Child Nutrition STAR webinar registration online. I'm expecting some updated tools and resources to be available on this webinar and plan to attend this session myself to learn of any additional strategies that ensure food safety and support emergency preparedness. An effective emergency preparedness plan meets specific needs of the food service operation. Prior preparation, employee training, and practicing for real-world scenarios are keys to success. An effective emergency preparedness plan properly prepares the program to ensure the safe production, service, and storage of food. The Institute of Child Nutrition developed a 6-step visual plan along with clear guidance for each step in the process. The QR code on the bottom right of this slide links directly to ICN's steps for emergency preparedness. A hyperlink has also been added to the picture to link directly to the ICN site. Now that we have covered planning and procedures before a hurricane, let us move on to discuss preparation for a coordinated response after a hurricane strikes. After a hurricane strikes, follow LDH guidelines for safety and resuming operations. When planning to return after a hurricane, contact the local health department for approval to reopen or operate if a sufficient quantity of potable water is not provided to all fixtures that require water, if electrical power has been lost for 4 or more hours, if floodwaters have entered the food service operation, when the sewer system is not properly functioning, or if a fire inside the facility has occurred, and when water pressure has been lost or a boil notice is in effect. Make sure that you understand claim processes and procedures for both FEMA and insurance before going back on site after a hurricane. Once it is deemed safe for you to return to the school sites and offices, make sure that documentation of damage and inventories is a first step before cleanup begins. Take photos of damage to kitchen equipment, water marks on walls, water in steam table pans, water in or damage to refrigerators, holes in the ceiling, buckled dining room tables, walk-in coolers, freezers that may have moved off their foundation. Keep security camera footage that may show how high the water came on trucks and buildings. Keep hard copy inventory of small equipment, food, supplies, and large equipment inventory losses. Documentation is very important during a disaster in order to secure replacement of items from FEMA or insurance, or to give contractors an understanding of the extent of damages that may not be apparent when doing a walkthrough assessment. As you can see here, pictures can illustrate damages due to flooding that may not be explicit when the floodwaters go down. Pictures help show the contamination of equipment and the extent of damage to furniture, the interior and exterior buildings, as well as equipment. I would like to thank Dr. Mann of East Baton Rouge Parish Schools for sharing these post-disaster pictures and providing tips on the insurance and FEMA claims documentation processes that I'm sharing today. If you have helpful tips, scenarios, or pictures to share, please send me an email at helen.folks@la.gov. When discussing important considerations for hurricane preparedness with the Louisiana Department of Health, the following considerations were emphasized. C&P operators must ensure potable water is available before attempting to open food service operations or prepare foods. When completing the emergency readiness plan forms in the guide provided, be sure to pre-plan utility contacts and plan in advance with vendors to secure water tanks and bottled water to ensure there is sufficient potable water for cooking and water consumption by students and staff. A general guide for planning the amount of water needed to resume services is that 1 gallon of potable water per individual per day, plus what is needed for cooking, must be available. Be certain to follow LDH and other utility instructions on boil advisories by boiling water using the instructions provided by LDH prior to use in cooking. It is important to predetermine any contracts for cleanup and designate roles for maintenance and food service staff as part of the cleanup and recovery process that must take place prior to resuming production and service of meals. If you have current contracts for generators and emergency water trucks, make sure they are up to date and that your service provider stands ready to provide for your needs in the event of a hurricane. Supply chain issues and staffing shortages could mean that your standby contractors and service providers are no longer able to demonstrate the ability to meet the demand of your district. It is important to identify resources now, complete procurement activities, and update contracts. LDH provides emergency guides under the link on this slide titled "In Case of Disaster." Print these guides to ensure safe operations after a hurricane. Fact sheets included at this link include operating food service after an emergency, boil advisory guidelines for food service operations, what to do after a flood, food safety for power outages, and information videos on food safety for power outages. An additional guide to keep on hand is how to apply food safety principles during alternative meal services. This guide was prepared for the purposes of the pandemic, but it also applies to alternative services that may result from a hurricane. Food safety during a power outage is a concern whether the electricity goes out for hours or for days. Best practices for hurricane threats include consolidating frozen and/or refrigerated foods at a central location with generator backup. Use of rented mobile refrigerators or freezers is an option, or using trucks that are either refrigerated or frozen. An important consideration before a hurricane is to ensure that employees will be available that are licensed to drive a truck and that vehicles are gassed up and located in an area least likely to be susceptible to flood waters. Remember that if you are planning to store foods in frozen or refrigerated trucks, a sufficient amount of fuel must be available to keep the trucks running and temperatures controlled. Foodsafety.gov provides charts on when to salvage foods after a power outage, and a link is provided on this slide. Power outages may be for as little as a few hours or could extend for days. This guide explains food handling according to the amount of time the power has been out. As the USDA states in the link, keeping food safe during an emergency, refrigerators will keep food safe for up to 4 hours during a power outage. Keep the door closed as much as possible. Discard refrigerated perishable foods such as meat, poultry, fish, eggs, and leftovers after 4 hours without power. You will have to evaluate each item separately, and the chart provided is meant to be a general guide. A full freezer will hold a safe temperature for approximately 48 hours, or 24 hours if it is half full and the door remains closed. Remember to never taste food to determine its safety. Use the refrigerated and frozen foods chart as a general guide, and when in doubt, throw it out. Floodwaters can damage many foods in a school nutrition operation, but some foods may be salvaged. School nutrition employees need to know what foods can be safely salvaged and how to salvage those foods. Using proper salvaging methods will save money while maintaining the safety of the food available to serve. C&P operators and managers must check all food for exposure to floodwaters, discarding foods that may have been damaged, and cleaning and sanitizing packages of food that can be salvaged. If a school has been required to close its kitchen due to a flood, it should not reopen until it has been authorized to do so by local or state regulatory authority. Refer to the Institute of Child Nutrition's guide titled "Salvaging Food After a Flood" to ensure safe recovery of food, and always remember, when in doubt, throw it out. During hurricanes and other weather events that disrupt electricity or deliveries, Milk is the first menu component that is of concern. In terms of regular operations, two types of fluid milk must be offered, one being unflavored milk. Currently, there is a transitional meal standard rule allowing 1% flavored milk. However, typically typically fat content must be fat-free or low-fat. Flavored milk must be fat-free, while unflavored milk may be fat-free or 1%. Pasteurized fluid milk with levels of vitamins A and D specified are also required. In the instance of an emergency, such as a hurricane, where conditions temporarily prevent a school that normally has a supply of fluid milk from obtaining delivery of such milk, the state agency may allow the school to serve meals during the emergency period with an alternate form of fluid milk or without fluid milk. Approval by the state agency occurs on a case-by-case basis, and the SFA must submit adequate justification in order for the meals served to be considered reimbursable. It is recommended that SFAs purchase a certain amount of shelf-stable fluid milk or dry milk in order to meet short-term needs, consisting of a 3-day supply. This regulation should only be used in a short-term emergency with efforts in place to resume regular milk delivery and services as soon as possible. Typically, a waiver submission and justification of delivery failures with documentation provided by the vendor will be required for approval. Okay, this overview is to highlight costs that commonly come into question during hurricane emergencies. First, funds from the nonprofit food service account be used to purchase bottled water as an alternative to water fountains and other on-site options. Now, this may come into question if there is a boil notice or if the sanitation of fountains is questionable and after a hurricane event. And the answer to this question is yes, the purchase of potable water to supplement meals is an allowable cost. For further information, please refer to Policy Memorandum SP 28-2011, Water Availability during NSLP Meal Service. Also, take a look at resources for making water available in schools and childcare facilities. State and local agencies are reminded that milk is expected to be served as part of each reimbursable meal, and potable water may not be provided as a substitute for milk. In terms of PPE, gloves, aprons, face masks, as well as cleaning and sanitary supplies are allowable costs during an emergency, provided that such purchases are made in support of child nutrition program operations. All purchases must continue to meet the required criteria of being reasonable, allocable, and necessary. Please refer to 2 CFR 200.404 and 200.405. In terms of staff salaries during mandatory closures, payment with school food service funds is allowable only when employee absences are covered under the local program operator's established personnel policies. F&S has determined that local program operators with such policies may continue to pay out salaries and benefits to their employees during mandatory closures, which qualify as authorized absence from the job for affected employees in accordance with 2 CFR 200.431B. These payments must be consistent with the program operator's policy of paying salaries under expected or unexpected or extraordinary circumstances from all funding sources, federal and non-federal, and must be fully allocable. Compensation in the form of hazard pay for employees continuing to work during closures is further considered an allowable cost, provided that such compensation is similarly permissible under the program operator's personnel policies, and the hazard pay in question is reasonable. Program operators may draft a new personnel policy if they don't have an existing one in place covering leave, salaries, and benefits during unexpected and extraordinary circumstances. Any new or updated policy must also be fully in accordance with the requirements of 2 CFR and consistent in their payment of salaries and benefits regardless of the funding sources used are available, both federal and non-federal, as described above. The reason I bring up this topic is because it's important to ensure that local policies are in place for hurricane-related closures and or hazard pay. This will play an important role in ensuring that such costs are covered during or after a hurricane event. Be sure to check with the state agency regarding salary questions as they relate to hurricane conditions and or closures that may present prior to approving staff pay for mandatory closures or approving hazard pay. There were several emergency procurement proclamations over the course of the pandemic, but it's important to note that emergency procurement proclamations for COVID-19 have expired and regular procurement procedures must be followed and documented. A nutrition support memo will be issued if the Office of the Governor issues a proclamation to allow emergency procurement of goods and services as a result of a hurricane or other weather emergency. In that case, you would want to stay aware of expiration and or extension dates and note that documentation of emergency procurement procedures is required during the emergency proclamation period. Procurement by non-competitive proposals under 2 CFR 200.320 are allowed when the public exigency or emergency does not permit a delay resulting from competitive solicitation. If you have an emergency where there is inadequate time or the emergency does not allow for procurement activities to take place, then document the emergency, justification, and purchase what is needed to fulfill the program responsibilities. In terms of allowable costs, under an emergency proclamation, costs applied under an emergency proclamation must fall within the regulations outlined in 2 CFR 200.403, factors affecting allowability of costs, which include but are not limited to the fact that the expenditures to the CNPs must be necessary, reasonable, and allocable for the performance of the federal award. Also note that costs must be adequately documented for audit purposes. Under 2 CFR 200, Emergency Procurement Regulations, if it is necessary to make an emergency procurement to continue services, the purchase shall be made and a log of all such purchases shall be maintained by a representative of the School Food Authority. The following emergency procedures shall be followed. All emergency procurements shall be approved by an SFA official knowledgeable of CNP regulations and someone who has signed the procurement certification for the Code of Conduct. Emergency procurement procedures that must be documented include the item name, the dollar amount, the vendor or contractor, and the reason for the emergency. Although the reference memo regarding emergency procurement was developed in response to COVID-19, the information is also applicable to hurricanes and other disasters which result in an emergency procurement. An important clarification regarding emergency procurement is included in USDA Memo SP 10/2021. And as soon as an exigent or emergency circumstance ceases to exist, SFAs must immediately begin the process of competitively procuring similar goods and services in order to transition to a competitively procured contract. Please note that each non-competitive procurement method used requires a separate justification to address threats to life, improved property, and public health and safety. Regulations and resources to guide you through meal programs during a disaster response are included on this page, including meal service during unanticipated school and daycare closures, a USDA disaster response memo, providing CNP benefits to disaster survivor evacuees, the eligibility manual for school meals, and USDA's FNS disaster assistance information. The information provided on this slide covers frequent issues reported by SFAs during several hurricanes, including Hurricane Laura. While I don't plan to read the list, I did want to provide it as a resource for your review to ensure that you're prepared for these types of interruptions to service that commonly occur during hurricane season. This will allow you to evaluate your risks and do some types of preparation. USDA foods for disaster response will be discussed as a final topic for this presentation. Program resources, regulations, and procedures must be considered when handling and requesting USDA foods assistance during a disaster such as a hurricane. USDA provides tiered access to funding based on the level of the disaster. USDA foods may be issued to provide relief when resources are sufficient during a situation of distress, presidential emergency declaration, or presidentially declared major disaster. There are different disaster types and allowances for USDA foods depending on the type. In all instances, sponsors must notify the food distribution program of the type of situation and foods needed, and the distributing agency will stay in contact with USDA as necessary. The USDA Foods Program Disaster Manual is linked on this slide as a reference for planning. Page 73 of this manual provides specific information on USDA food disaster preparedness for school food authorities. Please print this guide and add it to your hurricane plan. The state distribution agency's role in a hurricane or disaster is to communicate with SFAs when foods may be used for congregate feeding and to allow SFAs to utilize USDA foods in situation of distress. Additionally, the SDA provides FNS with source documents from SFAs of inventory used during the emergency. In a presidentially declared disaster or emergency, USDA foods can be used for congregate feeding and are guaranteed to be replaced and do not need further USDA headquarters approval. The state distributing agency has the authority to release USDA foods for congregate feeding sites upon SFA request. As introduced earlier in this training, a situation of distress is a natural catastrophe or other event that does not meet the definition of a disaster. Examples could include a hurricane, fire, flood, or snowstorm. A situation of distress is described as a natural catastrophic event or other situation that has not been declared a disaster or emergency by the president, but in the judgment of the state distributing agency, or FNS, it warrants the use of USDA foods. In a situation of distress, no presidential declaration is required. The distributing agency works to replace USDA foods through food and nutrition services to the extent that funds are available. The state distributing agency can release USDA foods for congregate feeding sites only if there is a natural event and it is limited to 30 days. If the event is not deemed a natural event, the state distributing agency must obtain FNS approval before releasing USDA foods. In terms of record keeping, the following documentation must be completed by the SFA. First, the material code and description of the USDA foods used. Second, the quantity or cases of USDA foods used. Third, the number of individuals served at congregate feeding sites. Fourth, the date USDA foods were issued to a congregate feeding site. And fifth, the name of the organization receiving the inventory. Attachment 10 of the Louisiana NSLP handbook should be used as a template for documenting purposes. Two forms that may be required for USDA foods reporting in a hurricane event are Attachment 9 and 10. On the left-hand side is Attachment 9, which is used for documenting redonation of USDA foods. This form should be completed in triplicate at the time of redonation of a commodity item to another eligible recipient agency. Prior approval for a redonation must be given by the Food Distribution Field Supervisor or Food Distribution Division, as some categories of recipient agencies are not eligible for certain commodity items. The inventory of the recipient agency must also be considered. Copies of the redonation statement should be retained by both the donating and receiving agencies, and the original should be sent to the Louisiana Department of Agriculture and Forestry's Food Distribution Division. The disaster feeding reporting form on the right, attachment 10, was referenced on the last slide, and it is included as part of the Louisiana NSLP handbook. This form is used to document emergency feeding and must be returned to the SDA office within 72 hours of emergency feeding with applicable attachments. The Louisiana State Distribution Agency contact information is provided on this slide. Please use the contact list for questions regarding USDA foods during a hurricane or other emergency. I want to thank everybody for your time and attention today for hurricane preparedness training. Please contact nutrition support for questions that you may have at 225-342-9661 or by emailing. The email address to email is childnutritionprograms@la.gov. All right, I'm going to take a look at the chat box. I don't see any current questions. Now, if you do have questions, definitely use the information on this slide, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. And because it is about 5 minutes after 2, I'm going to go ahead and conclude our training and thank everyone again for your participation.